The next time you're in Washington, D.C., and you've run out of touristy stuff to do, I have a recommendation. Grab a car, drive south of the city on Interstate 95 for approximately 30 miles. And there on the left-hand side of the interstate, poking just above the tree line, you'll see a strange-looking edifice built at a rather unusual angle. You might think to yourself, what is this odd-looking edifice off to the left-hand side of the interstate? So perhaps you'll take the exit and you'll go investigate further. What you'll find is that this strange-looking edifice is actually a museum. It's the Marine Corps Museum, and the unusual shape of the building is a direct homage in architecture to one of the most famous images in Marine Corps history, not to mention in American history. And I'm speaking, of course, about the Iwo Jima flag-raising photo. Taken by Joe Rosenthal in February 1945, atop Mount Suribachi on the island of Iwo Jima in the midst of the battle for the Pacific. Now, I often use this image in classroom discussions, and when my students talk about this image, you might imagine what kinds of reactions they have. They'll use words like energetic and powerful and emotive and moving. But when I probe a bit further and I ask them what precise aspect of this image makes you come to those conclusions, makes you feel those feelings, the discussion starts to falter a little bit. It turns out that we feel something powerful going on in this image, but even though it's right there in front of us, it's hard for us to put our fingers on it. So then I do something a little bit different. I change up the conversation and I give them a different perspective on the Iwo Jima flag-raising photo. I show it to them in reverse. So here you can see an example of our reversed version of the flag-raising photograph. Note, this is the same number of pixels. It's the same general shape. It's the same shading, the same characters. And yet, in class conversation, my students often don't know what to say about this version of the image. Those who can express something will say words like, it feels somehow powerless or inert, like it's not really in motion any longer. The conversation then turns to ideas about visual theory, and that's what I propose to do in this talk today. To dig into visual theory, specifically the idea of narrative images, the vectors that we find in narrative images, and how those vectors are wrapped up inevitably in our conceptualization of time and how time unfolds from the left to the right. Sounds pretty complex, but it's actually simpler than you might think. Let's begin with this notion of narrative images. What does it mean to say that an image can be a narrative? Well, put most simply, it suggests that when you look at the narrative, you can intuit a moment before and a moment after, or several moments before, several moments after. Looking at our Iwo Jima photograph, for instance, we can very easily imagine moments that led up to this timeless moment captured in the single moment. We can imagine the Marines clambering up the side of Mount Suribachi, under fire, desperate, trying to get to the top. We can imagine them unfurling the flag and finally getting to the point where they're ready to raise it. After this moment, we can imagine them getting the flag fully upright, heaving a sigh of satisfaction at their labor, and perhaps even in listening to the cheers of the Marines still down below at the bottom of the mountain and still on ships in the ocean. So this is indeed a narrative image that allows us to see a before and an after. Let's look at another example, going back in time, here we are, to the 11th century. This is a snippet from the Bayeux Tapestry, which commemorates William the Conqueror's invasion of Britain that culminated in the Battle of Hastings in 1066. And as you look at this snippet of the much larger tapestry, here too, I'm sure you can see the implied narrative. You can imagine where these horse riders, where these soldiers have come from just a moment before this image. They've entered the screen from our left. You can also imagine where they're headed, off the screen to our right. It is then a narrative image. Now, visual theorists try to capture, using some interesting vocabulary, how this motion works in imagery. And they use a key term that I want to introduce to you called vectors. So a vector for a visual theorist is a way of trying to describe the motion, the patterns of causality and action in a particular still moment. And as you can imagine, that motion often goes in one direction or another. Let's look further at this Bayeux Tapestry image, and you'll get a sense for some of the vectors going on in it. Notice, as the horses are aimed to the viewer's right, we sense a feeling of motion. That's the direction they're heading in next. The eye gaze of the soldiers on top of the horses are aimed at the right. Even the spears function as almost literal arrows, indicating that all the motion here is toward the right. What we have then are vectors, or a vector that captures the motion of this image as it unfolds from the left-hand side, we might say the past, into the future moment, presumably where the enemy is located. We can do something very similar with the Iwo Jima image. Now you note here that our vectors are more angular. They're not as horizontal as they are in the Bayeux Tapestry, and yet they're still moving from left to right. In this case, the upper left to the bottom right, once again indicating a kind of forward motion in time. We can almost see this as a still in the movie where the next moment is going to be the flag fully upraised in the direction of the arrows. So these vectors are a way, this notion of vectors is a way of capturing that motion, those patterns of causality in visuals. So let's return then to the idea of narratives as a whole, because I think you're going to find that time is involved here as well. Now, we've all thought about narratives in the past, or we've studied them in classes. So we all know that a narrative has a beginning and a middle and an end. So you all recall this from your classes. And it turns out, of course, that narratives are thus time-bound because they flow from the past into the present and finally into the future. Narrative images work in a similar way. Even though we're seeing just a snippet of a moment, that flow is still visible to us in many cases. Let's take a look at another example, this time going back to Michelangelo's David and Goliath, a depiction on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, painted by Michelangelo many centuries ago. If you study this image, you might ask yourself, well, what's going to happen next? And it may feel pretty obvious. I think it is. But how do you know what's going to happen next? Chances are, in terms of visual theory, you are intuitively looking at the vector. Follow the line from David's right arm through his left arm, extending further through Goliath's left arm. Do you see a straight diagonal going from top left to bottom right? That vector is a way for the visual to intuitively communicate to us a kind of forward motion. And so we can guess pretty easily that in just a moment, what's going to happen is that sword is going to flash down that same arc, and very soon Goliath is going to meet a rather gruesome end. So our image here is not only a narrative image, it not only has a vector, it's also wrapped up in our conceptualization of time, flowing from the left-hand side into future moments toward the right. So this might seem a little unusual to you, but it turns out there's lots of research that goes into this idea that our conceptualization of time has a direction. I'll give you some examples. So scholars who study how we conceptualize movies will sometimes ask their subjects to draw sketches from a movie that they've just seen. And they invariably find that those sketches follow a predictable progression from left to right, duplicating what happened in the movie, that forward motion of the narrative. Scholars who study marketing often suggest that visual appeals also have an element of time, aiming toward the product, which tends to be toward the right. This kind of experience repeats itself in our everyday lives. So for instance, if you were to visit the doctor's office and hold a printout of an electrocardiogram reading, if you wanted to see what your pulse was doing 3 minutes ago, you would move on the tape to the left. And if you wanted to return back to the present moment, you would go back to the right. Or let's say you get tired of being at the doctor's office, and so you pick up a newspaper and you turn to the comics page. You look at the comic strips. You'll quickly notice those comic strips take place in sequence, moving from left to right, from the past into the future. One more example. Even fonts can express an element of time. If you've ever thought to yourself, looking at a word on your screen, I really want to emphasize this, to express a sense of urgency with this word or this phrase, you probably chose an italics font. But look at the font. It's leaning to the right, indicating a movement into the future, a sense of hurriedness that expresses urgency. What better way to indicate emphasis in our very papers that we write? So what you see here then overall is that narrative images allow us to see a before and an after that visual theorists express as a kind of vector. My argument here, my conjecture, is that our conceptualization of time is inevitably wrapped up in that experience, and that is what helps us to interpret narrative images. So this is an interesting thesis, but we kind of have to test theses sometimes. So let me offer you some additional examples from my own experience. So some years ago, I had the privilege of serving as a guest curator for an exhibition organized by the Norman Rockwell Museum. This was a commemoration of the 75th anniversary of Norman Rockwell's 4 freedoms. And on the screen here, you can see the first of those 4 freedoms, freedom of speech. As part of this exhibition, I worked closely with the audiovisual team to create an interactive display in which visitors could look very closely at over 100 posters from the World War II era, specifically posters created by the US side. You got one view of the war in these hundreds of posters, and you could see them in granular detail. So I propose that this is a reasonable sample for us to draw some examples from to further test this idea of vectors and the directionality of time. Let's take a look at some examples drawn from this interactive in the exhibition. We can begin with these 2 images showing us some soldiers. On the top right, you'll see 2 soldiers apparently near the battlefield. Look at their eye gaze. Where are they looking? Look at their weapons. Where are the weapons pointing? This suggests to us that the vector is moving toward the right. And if these soldiers are going to charge at the enemy in any future moment, that movement is going to be from left to right into the future. In the other image, Private Joe Lewis is looking directly at us. He's violating the 4th wall. And yet, notice that he, like the italics font, is leaning to our right, and his bayonet is fixed, aiming in that same direction. It's as if he's paused for just a moment to offer us a word of advice, and now he's going to rush off to battle from left to right, past into future. Well, what about Uncle Sam? Uncle Sam makes plenty of appearances in these posters as well. And in these two examples, you can see again that vector moving from left to right with the enemy located on the right-hand side as we view the visual. On the top image, we see Uncle Sam's pointing finger, his eye gaze. We see the planes above. We see the charging soldiers below, all indicating that movement toward the right. And the same is true for the other image, indicating who's next in the course of battle, off to the right. So far we have some reasonably good confirmation of our conjecture. But there are some anomalies in our data set. Let's look at those and see if they disconfirm our conjectures. I want to begin with these two posters, which, although narrative, express a vector that's clearly from right to left. And so you might ask yourself, well, wait a second. Are these figures, our civilian air patrol person and our bird, our eagle, flying from right to left as if they're flying into the past? I would disagree with that assessment. I suggest what sets these two images apart and the reason why the vector is moving to the left is that they're addressed at a civilian audience. They're focused on the home front. And if the enemy is off to the right in our conceptualization of the war visually, the home front is off to the left. So this fits into our broader scheme of directionality in wartime posters. How about this example, this poor fellow who's mourning the loss of one of his comrades on the field of battle? Here again, we see that the vectors are aimed toward the left, moving from right to left. Is our figure moving back in time? I would suggest that he's not. Rather, he's paused for a moment of contemplation. But soon, he'll be moving off toward the enemy, again toward the right. So forward motion seems to indicate left to right, movement into the future, but we can also pause, and that might shift the nature of the vectors that we see in these images. Let me give you one more example. And that's this rather unusual example from 1943. Here we can see that the vector is again aimed from right to left, but these soldiers are in fact walking back in time. And you can see that indicated by the years on the top of the poster. They're moving from 1943 back in time to the colonial era, presumably to gain some inspiration from those Revolutionary War combatants. So this is actually a confirmation of our conjecture about the nature of time unfolding from left to right, in this case, from right to left, because they're moving into the past. So today we've talked about this idea of narrative images and how vectors are involved in our descriptions and our understandings of how narrative images work. And my supposition has been that that inevitably involves our understanding of time, that we tend to conceptualize time as moving from left to right, and that inevitably influences how we read images that appear before us. This, it seems to me, is the case when it comes to the Iwo Jima image. We perceive it in time, even though it's a frozen moment. So, the next time you find yourself in Washington and you're looking for touristy stuff to do, I recommend driving south about 30 miles, checking out the Marine Corps Museum, because on the walls and displays of that museum, you'll find plentiful narrative images, and you can test out this theory, which of course you can do in just about any museum across the world. Hopefully you'll see those images now in a new way.